To enjoy this episode ad-free, please visit patreon.com/forensictales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
What started as rumors surrounding a secluded Indiana estate would eventually uncover one of the most disturbing crime scenes in the Midwest. Scattered across the property were thousands of human bone fragments, burned, crushed, and buried for years. Investigators soon realized this wasn't a single murder scene, but the possible hunting ground of a serial killer targeting men who had vanished without a trace. This is Forensic Tales, episode 336, The Serial Killer of Fox Hollow Farm. Welcome to Forensic Tales. I'm your host, Courtney Fretwell. Forensic Tales is a weekly true crime podcast with a forensic twist. Each episode features real stories highlighting how forensic science was used to uncover the truth. If you enjoy deep dives into real cases and the science behind them, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you want even more content, including monthly full-length bonus episodes and early ad-free access to over 300 episodes, you can join our community over on Patreon. The support there truly helps keep this show going. To learn more, visit patreon.com/forensictales. And one small favor that makes a huge difference for the show, if you're enjoying Forensic Tales, please consider leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps other listeners discover the podcast. To the outside world, he looked like the picture of success: a husband, a father of 3, a respected businessman living in an upscale home just outside of Indianapolis. Neighbors described him as quiet, intelligent, maybe a little odd at times, but certainly not dangerous. But behind the carefully constructed image was a man living a double life, one that investigators would later connect to the disappearances of multiple men throughout the Indianapolis area during the 1980s and 1990s. Because sometimes serial killers don't hide in dark alleyways or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they hide in plain sight, behind manicured lawns, family photos, and the illusion of an ordinary life. His name is Herb Baumeister. He was born on April 7th, 1947, in Indianapolis, Indiana, with a sister and 2 brothers. He grew up in what seemed to be a stable, respectable family. His father was an anesthesiologist, and his mom was super involved with the kids. And when his father's medical practice began to take off, the family moved to affluent Washington Township. At North Central High School, he wasn't exactly part of the in crowd, but he was still pretty involved in things. He liked biology, geology, government, international relations, and even chess. And once he graduated, he was accepted into Indiana University, where he met Juliana Sater. The two instantly hit it off, mostly over their shared conservative views. And for a while, Herb's life followed the kind of path people expected: college, marriage, a job, children, a business. But he didn't stay at Indiana University for long. He dropped out in his freshman year, returned for a semester here and there throughout the next 4 years, but never graduated. He eventually got a job as a copy boy at the Indianapolis Star, mostly due to his father's connections. And in 1971, he married Juliana in a United Methodist church in Indiana. Together, they would go on to have 3 children: Marie in 1979, Eric in 1981, and Emily in 1984. And although Juliana graduated with a journalism degree from Indiana University, she decided to put her career on hold to raise the children. By the late 1980s, Herb came up with a pretty brilliant business idea. In 1988, he borrowed $4,000 from his mom and opened a thrift store, selling used clothing, household goods, and other secondhand items. And the concept really seemed to take off. In his first year of business, he made over $50,000, which allowed him to open a second store. And from there, the business just exploded. He started making a lot of money, and it really benefited his family. In 1991, they moved from their middle-class home into the fashionable Westfield district, about 20 miles from Indianapolis. It was there that Herb purchased the 18-acre property known as Fox Hollow Farm. The house was absolutely beautiful. It had 4 bedrooms, an indoor swimming pool, and horse stables. It was just the kind of house that Juliana dreamed about raising her children in. From the outside looking in, he seemed to have it all. But beneath that ordinary surface, there were cracks. And eventually, those cracks would lead investigators to the woods behind Fox Hollow Farm and to the remains of multiple men who had vanished from the Indianapolis area. The first sign that Herb wasn't your typical kid happened when he was pretty young. He would apparently tell other kids at school that he wondered what it would be like to taste human urine. But that was just the beginning of his weird obsession with urine. He would also do things like urinate on his teachers' desks at school, and he became really obsessed with dead animals. And I know sometimes when we talk about childhood red flags in true crime cases, it can feel a little too neat and tidy, like we're trying to work backward and make every strange behavior fit the ending. But in Herb's case, these weren't just minor quirks that people later exaggerated. They were concerning enough that when he was a teenager, his own father arranged for him to undergo intense psychiatric evaluations. And he was reportedly diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder. But according to the available reporting, he didn't receive any meaningful long-term psychiatric treatment after that. It's impossible to go back in time, but had he received some type of treatment, maybe we wouldn't be talking about him all these years later. Maybe the so-called Fox Hollow Farm serial killer would have never existed. It's also unclear why he didn't get any treatment. I don't know if it's because Herb simply refused to participate, or maybe his dad had something to do with it. He obviously knew something wasn't right, so that's why he took him to get evaluated in the first place. But this was during a time when mental health wasn't something people liked to talk about. So it's possible that Herb's father was ashamed of him and didn't want people to know he had things going on. His dad was a well-respected doctor in the community and probably wanted to keep the image of being the picture-perfect family. So they just ignored it and pretended like nothing was wrong. In hindsight, that decision was a terrible mistake. As Herb got older and moved into adulthood, those red flags didn't disappear. They just became a lot easier to hide behind things like jobs, a 25-year marriage, 3 children, and eventually a successful business. That's what I mean when I say this man was literally able to hide in plain sight. In 1972, just 6 months after marrying Juliana, he spent 2 months in a psychiatric hospital. And to some, that might have looked like just a temporary crisis, something private, something the family could move past. But over the years, there were more and more signs that something was very wrong. From about 1974 to 1985, Herb worked at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. This was before he borrowed the money to open the thrift stores. And by most accounts, He was a hard worker. He wasn't someone who couldn't hold a job or function in society. In fact, he eventually earned the title of program director. But even there, his behavior stood out. At one point, he reportedly sent Christmas cards showing himself and another man dressed in drag, which on its own might just sound strange or awkward or even like a bad joke. But his coworkers also described other behavior that was harder to dismiss. And eventually, Herb's career at the BMV ended after he reportedly urinated on a letter that had been addressed to the governor. So again, we see this same pattern: public life, responsibility, normalcy. And then these bizarre, disturbing acts breaking through the surface. We also see his strange obsession with urine time and time again. In 1985, he was involved in a hit and run while drinking and driving. And about a year later, a warrant was filed for his arrest. He was charged with auto theft, a Class A misdemeanor, and conspiracy to commit theft, which was a Class D felony. But he ultimately beat the conspiracy charge after a one-day bench trial. And yet, despite all of this, Herb continued moving forward in life. He was still a husband, still a father, still someone who, to many people, probably seemed odd but not necessarily dangerous. At least, not yet. Because soon, his life would change from weird behavior and private warning signs to something much darker. A discovery on the family property would eventually reveal that the strange man living behind the walls of Fox Hollow Farm may have been hiding more than a double life. A life involving young men, gay bars, and murder. Beginning in the early 1980s, young men throughout the Indiana and Ohio area started disappearing. Many of them were last seen around the city's gay bars and nightlife districts, places that, at the time, were often heavily stigmatized and underpoliced. And because of that stigma, some of these young men initially didn't receive the type of attention they deserved, either from the police or the public. Sadly, to many people at the time, these were just young gay men that no one cared about. A lot of the missing men also lived what investigators would later describe as high-risk or vulnerable lifestyles. Some were estranged from their families, some struggled with addiction, some engaged in sex work, others drifted between jobs or housing situations, making it easier for their disappearances to go unnoticed for days, sometimes even weeks. We've talked about this in previous episodes involving female sex workers. Back in the 80s, 90s, even early 2000s, a lot of police departments simply refused to investigate missing person cases involving female sex workers. It was almost like the police blamed the victims for what happened to them, which is really, really sad. And hopefully, we've come a long way since then. But that's exactly what happened to a lot of these missing young men. The police just didn't care because they were gay or sex workers. When these cases first started popping up, they didn't necessarily seem connected. But the deeper you dig and the more bodies of these missing men start surfacing, the more obvious the similarities become. Many of the young men were found partially clothed or without any clothes at all. They were also found in rural areas, ditches, creeks, abandoned roadsides, often near Interstate 70 in Indiana and Ohio. And perhaps most importantly, many of them had been strangled. Investigators would eventually begin referring to the unknown offender as the I-70 Strangler. And one of the earlier victims of his was 15-year-old Michael Sean Petrie, whose body was discovered in Hamilton County in 1980. He had reportedly spent time around Indianapolis gay bars before his disappearance, and his cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Then there was 14-year-old Delvoyd Lee Baker, found partially nude near a river in 1982. Witnesses later reported seeing him climb into a blue van with an unidentified man before he vanished. In 1983, 22-year-old Michael McRiley disappeared after leaving an Indianapolis nightclub with another man. His nude body was later found in a ditch. Investigators believed he had also been strangled. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Throughout the rest of the 1980s and early 1990s, the body count just kept getting higher and higher, all with almost the same MO. Most of them were naked or pretty close to it. Almost all had signs of ligature strangulation, suggesting ropes or towels may have been used, and many had last been seen near Indianapolis gay bars. It got to a point where the similarities were impossible to ignore. The police knew they had a serial killer on their hands, but catching him was a whole different story. Many of these cases remained unsolved, and for years on end, investigators had no idea that the person potentially responsible may have been hiding in plain sight the entire time, living quietly in suburban Indiana with a wife, children, and a successful business. In fact, investigators would later theorize that the murders along Interstate 70 may have suddenly stopped for a chilling reason, because in 1991, Herb purchased a secluded 18-acre property in Westfield, Indiana, known as Fox Hollow Farm, and after that, victims may no longer have needed to be dumped alongside the highway at all. In 1994, investigators with the Marion County Sheriff's Department and the Indianapolis Police Department were contacted by a man named Tony Harris. And what he was about to tell them would completely change the direction of the investigation into the missing and murdered young men connected to Indianapolis's gay nightlife scene. Tony Harris claimed that a man who called himself Brian Smart was hanging around a lot of the area's gay bars, and may be the person responsible for his friend Roger Rudlett's murder. And he had every right to be very suspicious of this Brian Smart guy. According to Tony Harris, he met Brian Smart at the 501 Club, an Indianapolis gay bar, one night, and the encounter led them back to what he described as Brian Smart's mansion. But while they were there, he said Brian Smart tried to strangle him to death with a pool hose. Fortunately, he managed to escape and survive the terrifying encounter. But that wasn't the last time he said he saw Brian Smart. He said that he saw this man again in August of 1995 when he caught him trying to follow him in his car. He was able to write down the man's license plate, and that's when he found out his name wasn't actually Brian Smart. It was Herb. So he went straight to the police to not only tell them about his own attack, but also about his suspicions that Herb may have murdered his missing friend. As soon as the police got the tip, they drove straight to Fox Hollow Farm, but when they got there, they were met with resistance. Neither Juliana nor Herb would let detectives search the property, and although Tony Harris's tip seemed credible, it wasn't enough to get a search warrant. So because Herb wouldn't consent to the search and they didn't have a warrant, there was nothing else they could do. So the police eventually left, not knowing they were walking away from a property with thousands of human remains hidden on it. It's now June 1996, and police are once again turning their attention toward Fox Hollow Farm. But this time, things were much different, because this time, they finally had permission to search the property. Herb's wife, Juliana, had recently filed for divorce. By this point, Herb's behavior had become increasingly erratic, and according to reports, she was genuinely afraid of him. So while he was out of town, Juliana contacted investigators and essentially told them if they wanted to search the property, now was the time. So investigators arrived at Fox Hollow Farm prepared to take a closer look around the massive wooded estate. They already had reasons to be suspicious. Tony Harris had identified Herb as the man who allegedly tried to strangle him during a sexual encounter. Multiple men connected to Indianapolis's gay bar scene had vanished under eerily similar circumstances, and now investigators were finally being allowed onto the property of the man they believed might be connected to it all. The search took several days, a lot of resources, and a bunch of officers, but in the end, it was worth it. Because when all was said and done, a total of 11 sets of human remains were found, but only 8 of them would be eventually identified. And as it turned out, this search by police in 1996 wasn't the first time human remains had been found there. 2 years earlier, in 1994, Herb's own son found a bone while playing in the backyard. And it wasn't just any other ordinary bone. It was a fully skeletonized human skull. So the boy went to his parents and showed them what he found. But Herb shrugged it off and said it must have belonged to his father since he was a doctor. So he took it, stored it in the garage for a while, and then reburied it in another spot on the farm. Looking back, it's so chilling to think even Herb's own children encountered some of these human remains. It's one thing to find out you're related to a serial killer or your dad is a murderer, but it's a whole other ball game when you actually grew up surrounded by bodies. As soon as the 11 sets of remains were discovered, the police issued a warrant for Herb's arrest. But he wasn't going to go down quietly. Instead of turning himself in, Herb fled as far away as possible to Ontario, Canada. He thought he was smart enough to outrun the police, and he must have known that if they caught up to him, he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison, or even face the death penalty. He was now one of the worst serial killers this country has ever seen. But before the handcuffs could be slapped on his wrists, Herb did something unexpected. He shot and killed himself. He also left a 3-page suicide note, handwritten on yellow-lined paper. But in true Herb fashion, this wasn't any ordinary suicide letter. It talked about how sorry he was for messing up the park where he shot himself. He also talked about how sad he was that he destroyed his marriage, but he never once mentioned the missing young men or the human remains found in his backyard. He never admitted to committing any crime or committing any murders. Instead of coming clean, he used his suicide note to talk about all the other times he had considered suicide, but could never actually do it because of his 3 kids. He also wrote about what his last meal was, a peanut butter sandwich. But again, he never once mentioned the murdered young men. Right until the very end. He made it all about himself, not his countless victims. When Herb died, there were a total of 11 bodies found in his backyard. But that initial search in 1996, it was really just the beginning. Because decades later, investigators would return to the property and discover there may have been even more victims hidden there. In December of 2022, they conducted another search of Fox Hollow Farm. And during that search, they recovered an additional bone fragment and identified around 20 more areas where human remains may still be buried. And honestly, that's one of the most haunting parts of this entire case for me. Even after all these years, we still don't know the true number of victims connected to Herb Baumeister. We know he was responsible for murdering 11 young men, many of them gay, but that number could be so much higher. The actual number of victims could be anywhere from 20 to 30 men. Over time, some of the remains recovered from the property have finally been identified through advances in forensic science and DNA technology. But several victims still remain unidentified to this day. Investigators believe all of the unidentified remains belong to male homicide victims. And as of 2024, forensic experts were reportedly still working through nearly 10,000 human bone fragments recovered from Fox Hollow Farm. Think about that for a second. Not complete bodies, not intact skeletons, bone fragments. Because many of the remains had been burned, crushed, scattered, and buried across the property, creating an absolute forensic nightmare for investigators and anthropologists trying to determine exactly how many victims there were and who they were. And that's one of the main reasons why this case is still being worked today. Imagine dumping several jigsaw puzzles into a pile, then burning half the pieces. That's essentially what forensic anthropologists were dealing with. Their job wasn't just to identify victims. First, they had to determine which bones belonged to which person. And even after that, the work wasn't over. Many of the remains had been exposed to the elements for years, while others had been burned, making DNA recovery much more difficult. In some cases, investigators simply didn't have the technology available in the 1990s to identify the victims. That's why advances in DNA testing and forensic genetic genealogy have been so important in recent years. They are finally helping investigators put names to remains that sat unidentified for decades. The Hamilton County Coroner's Office has even asked members of the public with missing loved ones from the Indianapolis area during the 1980s and 1990s to submit DNA samples in hopes of finally giving some of these victims their names back. Can you imagine what that would be like for these families? They've spent decades wondering where their loved one is, and now they're faced with the possibility they may have become victims of a notorious serial killer, a serial killer who preyed on gay men at bars and nightclubs, who approached them under a fake name and alias, got them to come back to the house where his wife and 3 children slept at night, then murdered them and buried them in the same backyard where his kids played. Men like 20-year-old Johnny Bayer or Alan Livingston, whose remains were discovered during the initial search in 1996 but weren't identified until October 2023. He was actually the first victim to be identified following Hamilton County's new effort to identify more than 10,000 pieces of human remains. Then there was Daniel Halloran, who went missing sometime in March 1994. He wasn't identified until 2025 when genetic genealogy was used. And the list goes on and on. Jeffrey Jones, Richard Hamilton Jr., Stephen Hale, Alan Broussard, Mike Kieran, Manuel Resendez, and Roger Goodlett. One of the biggest questions surrounding Herb Baumeister is whether he was living a secret life that nobody around him truly understood. By all appearances, he was a conservative husband and father. Yet, we now know he spent years visiting Indianapolis gay bars, often using aliases like Brian Smart. And because all his known victims were killed, we don't know whether there was any sexual contact between them. We also don't really understand Herb's motivation to target gay bars. Was it because there was some sexual motivation behind it? Or were they just easy victims because he knew some of these men wouldn't have anyone looking for them if they went missing? Trying to figure out how to get the right mental health treatment for you can feel overwhelming. Talk I a Tree helps you move from I know I need help to actually having a psychiatrist who listens and a clear, personalized treatment plan. It's a 100% online psychiatry practice that provides comprehensive evaluations, diagnoses, and ongoing medication management for conditions like ADHD, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, OCD, PTSD, insomnia, and more. All 800 plus clinicians are in network with major insurers, so you can use your existing insurance instead of paying monthly subscriptions or out-of-network costs. Head to talkiatree.com/tales and complete the short assessment to get matched with an in-network psychiatrist in just a few minutes. That's talkiatree.com/tales to get matched in minutes. No one knows for sure whether Herb was gay or not. And what's even more interesting is that his wife later claimed the couple had been intimate only a handful of times throughout their entire marriage. So whether Herb was struggling with his sexuality, suppressing it, or simply using these bars to find victims is something we'll probably never know, because he took those answers with him when he died. Another big question for me is Herb Baumeister the still unknown I-70 Strangler? We still have no idea where his crimes first began. Some people believe Fox Hollow Farm was simply where investigators finally caught up with him. Others believe he had been killing for more than a decade before that. We already know that the bodies stopped popping up along I-70 right after he purchased the farm. And we know the victimology is almost identical. Young gay men last seen at Indianapolis gay bars who were strangled to death. But just like with the question on whether Herb was dealing with issues involving his sexuality, investigators never had the chance to ask him whether he was really the infamous I-70 Strangler. Herb Baumeister has been dead for nearly 30 years, yet investigators are still working this case. Not because they're trying to understand Herb, but because they're trying to identify the men he left behind. Maybe that's the most important part of this story. He spent years hiding behind the image of a successful businessman, husband, and father. He took countless answers with him when he pulled the trigger in that Canadian park. But unlike Herb, his victims are not forgotten. Nearly 30 years later, forensic scientists are still sorting through thousands of bone fragments, still comparing DNA samples, and still making phone calls to families who have spent decades wondering what happened to someone they loved. And until every victim is identified, the story of Fox Hollow Farm isn't over. To share your thoughts on this week's episode, or to share your theories about who the real Herb Baumeister is, be sure to follow us on social media at Forensic Tales. And if you want to listen to new episodes early and ad-free, consider signing up for our Patreon at patreon.com/Forensic Tales. You can get early ad-free access to new episodes and monthly full-length bonus episodes for as little as $3 a month. Your support on Patreon directly helps to fund the show's production, research, and editing costs. And as an independent, one-woman podcast, your support truly helps to keep the show going. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to support the show and help fund research, production, and editing, you can do so with a small monthly contribution on Patreon. Patreon supporters get early access to ad-free episodes and exclusive bonus content. You can learn more at patreon.com/Forensic Tales. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a positive rating or review really helps others discover it. For a full list of sources used in this episode, visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.